Hi, can you hear me? All right, great. Thank you so much, Carol, for the introduction and for inviting me back. And thanks so much to the rest of you for attending on this beautiful spring evening. Special thanks also to the staff here at VESR and to the members of the Valentine Reserve Fund for your continuing and really generous support. So, there we go. So for those of you who don't know me, as Carol said, my name is Pete Alagona. I've been a faculty member in the Environmental Studies program down at UCSB since 2009, which means it's been 15 years. That's hard to believe. And I've been associated with VESR for most of that time. I've been coming up here just to do research, to teach. My son is a graduate of several VESR camps, for sure. He's now 13. And I can say for sure that I love this place as much as you all do, and I appreciate it equally as much. I was also, I want to say, a member of the search committee at UCSB that hired Carol, and I am still patting myself on the back for that about a decade later. It's one of my greatest accomplishments at UCSB, for sure, 100%. So as Carol said, I've spoken in the seminar series before. It's actually my third time. My first time speaking was when Dan Dawson was the director here. Big round of applause for Dan, the dude. So that was at the Green Church. That was before this building was even built. That's right, yeah. The second time was in May of 2018 when I talked about this project when it was just in its infancy, just getting off the ground. And at that time I suggested that my collaborators and I were starting to learn some things about the California grizzly, about this animal in this place that we didn't expect. And that pattern has continued right on through to the present day. We have, in a way, I think, over the past 7 or 8 years, really rewritten the story, rewritten the history of grizzly bears in California. I think that the big question now is the story over, or is there another chapter? Now, there's a lot I don't have time to tell you about tonight. I've been working on this project really for almost a decade in one way or another now. I'm not going to tell you, for example, about the great work that we've been doing with several California tribes having discussions about this. I'm not going to tell you about the fact that we got the state Senate last year to declare 2024 the year of the grizzly in California. You might have missed that, now you know. I'm not going to tell you about the new exhibit that we worked on and helped to produce at the California Academy of Sciences, telling a little bit of the story about the California grizzly for the over 1.5 million folks who visit that museum in San Francisco each year. So there's a lot I don't have time to go into tonight. I also want to say that I am not here to convince you of anything. I am not. I can't tell you whether you should have grizzlies in your backyard in the High Sierra, just like you can't tell me whether I should have them in my backyard in Santa Barbara and Ventura, which is a possibility, which you'll see in a few minutes. So I'm not here to convince you of anything. Instead, in the brief time that we have here tonight, I want to try to achieve 3 modest goals here. So I want to just remind you of what this species is, what its status is, give you a little bit of a brief primer on grizzlies. I want to tell you a little bit about a document that's hot off the press that just came out about a month ago, this document called Recovering Grizzly Bears in California, a Feasibility Study. I'm going to go over just a handful of the major take-home messages from that. And then I'm going to offer a few reflections. And the reason I'm going to offer a few reflections is that I'm also writing a book about this, and a book is an opportunity to take a big step back to try to think much more broadly, maybe a 36,000-foot view, and maybe not think quite so much about what we can learn about the bears, but maybe think a little bit more about what the bears have to teach us about ourselves. And then I want to be absolutely sure to leave a lot of time for questions and discussion, because I know that this topic generates a lot of both. Okay, so first, the brown bear, which we call grizzly in most of Western North America, is one of 8 currently existing species of bears around the world. Its most close, the living relative that's most closely related to it is the polar bear. Brown bears and polar bears can actually mate in the wild and produce fertile offspring. There were more species of bears during the Pleistocene, but other species have gone extinct. And the brown bear is now the most widespread species of bear currently alive today, geographically, although the black bear, American black bear, is by far the most numerous. There are probably as many as 3 times the number of American black bears in the world as there are all the other bears in the world combined at this point. If you can believe that, maybe you can believe that. Brown bears are currently considered a IUCN species of least concern, which means they're in no danger of becoming threatened or endangered at any time in the near future. However, the last couple hundred years have not been particularly kind to the species. Over the last couple hundred years, their range has been roughly slashed in half. They've lost most of the southern portion of their range around the world, and their populations have probably also been roughly cut in half during that time. Today, there are something like maybe 35 or 40,000 brown bears in Alaska, maybe 25,000 to 30,000 in Canada, about 2,000 in the lower 48 US states. That number is up by, it's more than double over the past 40 years, so the population was much smaller when they were listed as threatened in the US in the lower 48 in 1975. There's about 25,000 in Europe, but that kind of depends on what you call Europe. If you look solely at the European countries that are part of the EU, there is something like 17,000 brown bears in Europe in about 22 different countries. That is the same species that we call grizzlies here. Keep that in mind. And then this estimate for Asia and the Middle East is very much a ballpark estimate. It could be anywhere between 100,000 and as many as 200,000. The vast majority, probably, of the world's brown bears live in the Russian Federation. Probably over 100,000. A little bit closer to home here in the lower 48 states, the map on the left there in the light green shows the areas that brown bears probably, or grizzlies probably inhabited around 1800. The dark green areas are the areas that they inhabited by about, 1900, something like that. The numbers there are the last sightings in a given area. And so you can see if you focus in, for example, on California, I know that it's a little bit hard to see, but there's a number that says 1924 there, and it's focused on the southwestern Sierra, actually on the west slope of Sequoia National Park. That's considered the last credible sighting of a grizzly bear in California, but we've actually found some archival evidence that suggests that that might not be the case. There might have been bears wandering around in the mountains of Santa Barbara and Ventura County a little bit later in the 1920s, but that 1924 sighting on the west slope of Sequoia National Park is still considered the last credible sighting by most folks. The map on the right just shows you, again, a little bit hard to see, but if you take a look at the feasibility study online, you'll be able to see it really well. It shows you the last sighting that we know of, that we were able to find, of a grizzly bear by county in California. And you can see that the number declined over time with a specific kind of geographic pattern having to do with the impact of settlement. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Today, and really for the past about 40 years or so, we've been trying to recover grizzly bears in the lower 48 US states, but only in a few areas. By 1975, the total population and range of grizzly bears in the US, in the lower 48, had probably declined by about 99% from its 1800 numbers and range. So about a 99% decline. So there were fewer than 1,000 grizzly bears in the lower 48 states, and they were restricted only to a few small areas in the northern Rockies primarily. Since then, the numbers have increased in places like Yellowstone and Glacier National Park, and there have been ongoing discussions really over the past 15 years about whether to keep them on the endangered species list or not, and as you can imagine, that's an ongoing debate. There was a plan that had been approved by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Department of the Interior last year to begin a reintroduction program for one of these recovery zones, the North Cascades area in northwestern Washington state. But as you can imagine, for reasons we all, I think, understand, that effort is currently on hold. So nothing is going on in the North Cascades, even though bears were supposed to go back there this year. So that's kind of the status of grizzly bears in the lower 48 now. So now I want to start telling you a little bit about what we've been doing here. So I told you that this feasibility study came out just last month. It's about a 200-page document, and it covers a lot of things that you would be interested in learning if you were going to think about, discuss, learn about, have an intelligent, evidence-based conversation about the future of grizzly bears in California. It has really two origins. So the first origin goes back to 2016, when I brought together a group of folks from a number of different fields at UCSB, political science, ecology, geography, history, anthropology, other fields, who were interested in this topic, to form a research group and to start developing projects to get a new understanding of the grizzly's history in California. At that time, in 2016, when we began our work, the most recent, really significant research on grizzly bears in California was a classic book that was published by the University of California Press in 1955. So we were looking at about a 60-year gap in significant research, with a couple little things here and there over the years, but not too much. And so we felt like there was a lot to learn, and we set about trying to do it. Over the next 6 years, we developed a number of projects, all of which really kind of helped to inform this study, along with work done by other groups in other parts of the country and world. And so by 2022, a number of these projects were kind of coming to fruition, the results were coming in, and it had become very clear to some of us in this group that the answers were all pointing in the same direction. And they were basically saying this, that for the past 100 years, there had been a kind of narrative, like a dominant story, right? And the story was that the extinction of grizzly bears in California was inevitable, and the recovery of the bears would be impossible. That's just the way history went, and that's all we need to know. What our research was showing, and when I say our research, I'm talking about history, I'm talking about ecological modeling, I'm talking about genomics, I'm talking about paleontological work from a wide variety of different fields, was all telling us was that the extinction wasn't inevitable, it was kind of a choice, and that the recovery of the bears in California would also be a choice. And so in 2022, I formed a different group, which had almost no overlap with the first research group, to try to figure out how we could start to get this message out to folks so that they could talk about it and learn about it and start a public conversation, not only about the past of grizzlies in California, but about their potential future. And so that 2022 group was really the origin of this feasibility study, which draws from research going back to 2016 and well before. So it's finally done. Like I said, the document is quite extensive, but it's by no means comprehensive. It's about a 200-page document. It covers a wide variety of different kinds of topics related to grizzlies in California, including suitable habitat, population viability modeling, ecosystem effects of potentially bringing the bears back, public support, both known and unknown, human safety issues around this topic, economics related to it, and other topics as well. I was one of the lead authors and editors on this, along with my colleague Alex McInturf at the University of Washington and our postdoctoral fellow Ellen Perro. I also just want to note that we have two forewords in this study, one of which was written by a really great guy named Octavio Escobedo, who's the chairman of the Tojon Indian tribe, which is based in the Bakersfield area in Central California, and whose ancestral lands cover portions of the southern San Joaquin Valley, the transverse ranges Tehachapi Range, and the Southern Sierra. And also Chris Tompkins, who may ring a bell for some of you as one of the most important and influential conservationists of our time, who, along with her late husband, Doug Tompkins, and friends and colleagues of theirs, were able to buy up, purchase, renovate, build infrastructure, and then donate a series of new national parks back to the governments of Chile and Argentina in the Patagonian region of South America. And so Chris is a resident of Southern California. She was born in Santa Paula. She has a passion for rewilding, and she was one of the folks who lent their support in the form of a foreword. I'm very thankful for that. Okay, So now I'm going to go through a handful of findings. Like I said, I'm just going to hit some of the big highlights here. Going to leave plenty of time for questions and conversation. And then after the findings, I'm just going to reflect a little bit. The first thing I want to say, and I've already alluded to this, is that grizzlies did not have to go extinct in California. The story of their extinction is usually told as one of European settlement, population growth, and agricultural expansion. And there's some truth to this. And that's certainly true in the coastal valleys, coastal ranges, in the really populated areas of California today, and the areas with large agricultural footprints. It's broadly true. But this version of the story also really sanitizes the history. And this is a very difficult thing to sort of face. And so I want to acknowledge that this can bring up a lot of emotions for folks. The actual story of the extinction of grizzly bears in California is a story that is inextricable from the genocide perpetrated against indigenous people in this state. I think many of us have probably heard about the relationship between the destruction of the bison on the Great Plains and the fate of indigenous people living in that region. Some of us have also probably heard about the ways in which the destruction of salmon runs in the Pacific Northwest were linked to cultural traditions, food security, and community integrity in places like the Pacific Northwest for indigenous groups in those regions. The grizzly bear story is different because it was not primarily a food species by any means. Many groups, including the group that is now called the Tohono Indian tribe that Octavio is a member of, actually had a prohibition against killing grizzly bears. But the grizzly bear was the animal that was most closely associated with many California indigenous groups in a broad cultural sense. You know, for the last 175 years or so, we've all been told that apes are our closest relatives. And that is true in an evolutionary sense. But in an ecological sense, our closest relatives are bears, and I hate to say it, pigs, because they are the other large omnivores, large terrestrial omnivores that are out there in the world. Grizzly bears in California in various regions ate almost the same exact diets as many indigenous people did. They were most numerous in many of the same areas that were most densely populated by humans in California, including in the coast ranges, along the central coast, in the nearby interior valleys there. Those were the areas that were most densely populated by both of us, and they were inextricably intertwined with indigenous society and culture. Beginning in the middle of the 19th century, when Anglo-American settlement happened in a big way in California, beginning in the 1840s, there was a campaign against indigenous people that many would agree qualifies under current international law, post-World War II international law, as genocide. If you want to read more about this, it's a tough topic to read about, I know, but Benjamin Madley, a historian at UCLA, has written a fantastic book about this. I know it's probably hard to see that, so I'm just going to read one of those clippings from a newspaper for you. I'll read the one on the right here. Los Angeles Daily News, Friday, April 30th, 1880. We all know that no nation upon the face of the globe has a greater cause for war than the Indian, to fight us to the last. But it is a cause such as the grizzly against the pioneer who invades his native wilds. Both are dealt with in a like manner. Indians are like wolves, pests to the country. They will not or cannot be civilized, hence must die out, and the sooner the better. Many of the same people who are most closely associated with Native American massacres in the state were also many of the same people who killed dozens, if not hundreds, of grizzly bears. They often did it with the same weapons. That did not have to happen. Finding number 2, although grizzly bears have been gone for California for a century, there are bears in other regions that would be available for a recovery program. Now, for a long time, at least since the 1960s, when the current taxonomic arrangement for brown bears worldwide kind of came into being, that's still kind of used today, the California grizzly has been considered a distinct subspecies, an extinct but distinct subspecies. It has a Latin name, Ursus arctos californianus, and we've always considered it as a kind of unique thing. Well, in a paper that is cited and used in this feasibility study, and that is actually finally coming out in the Journal of Heredity this coming month, we show, and this, by the way, was led by a postdoctoral fellow named Brock Wooldridge out of Beth Shapiro's paleogenomics lab at UC Santa Cruz, that California grizzlies were essentially genetically indistinguishable from the bears that live in places like Yellowstone today. Now, this makes sense given some of the other findings that we have and that we report here and in other papers. For example, it was long believed that grizzlies, although were very recent to California compared to black bears have been in California for maybe close to 1 million years, grizzly bears maybe a few tens of thousands of years. We've actually shown that the oldest positively identifiable grizzly fossil in California is only 8,000 years old. Now, that is incredibly recent in ecological and evolutionary history, but if that number is even in the ballpark, then what it suggests is California's grizzlies came from a recent common ancestor further north, and that actually matches up with the idea that they're closely related genetically to bears further north in North America today in the closest living populations, which are in the northern Rockies. So, what does this mean? Well, the first thing it means is that the California grizzly isn't extinct. It just currently lives in Montana. Maybe it's on vacation, 100-year vacation. The second thing it means is that although there aren't like extra spare bears running around in Montana and Wyoming, although maybe some people would say there are, what we can say is that populations from that region and maybe even further north in British Columbia, which contains something like 65% of the brown bears in Canada, could be available for a slow, small reintroduction program in California. So we don't have to worry about the bear being extinct because it's still out there. Finding number 3, this is a really important one. California probably still contains ample habitat for up to 3 populations of grizzly bears. All right, so how did we figure this out? Well, it's really hard to figure out what qualifies as suitable habitat for any species, even if it's there on the landscape, right? If it's been gone for 100 years, the landscape has changed dramatically since then, and no one studied it before, it gets really hard. And you have to do a lot of speculation, but you can reduce your possibility of really bad error by using a variety of different methods and trying to see where they overlap and diverge. And so that's what we did. What we did here is we used 4 different modeling methodologies based on historical data for grizzlies in California, 2 models on grizzly habitat use, one from the northern Rockies and one from Europe. And then we also looked at the distributions of other large carnivores in California, which have some similarities and some differences in the ways that they use habitats. Then we did a little bit of math to figure out how to overlay them. And we came up with this kind of astounding result that I think is way too much. Those 4 models overlap in about, with strong agreement, in about 35% of California. Now, I do not think that 35% of California is suitable grizzly habitat. I want you to know that. But that's what the models say, including the models that have been developed for Montana and for Europe. So what this does say is it says that there's probably still a lot of habitat out there. That kind of makes sense if Cal Fish and Wildlife is right, and we've now got about 60,000 black bears in California. It sort of makes sense, right? And so this is an important finding because for a long time people have been saying that there just isn't enough habitat. And this approach, with all of its benefits and certainly some flaws, suggests that that is correct, that there is still plenty of habitat out there. Now, the habitat has changed a lot, and one of the ways in which the habitat has changed, even in highly protected areas like national parks and wildernesses, is that the bears themselves haven't been there. Indigenous land use practices have been essentially absent from these landscapes for a long time. They've changed in myriad other ways. And so thinking about the ways in which the loss of a keystone species and the potential recovery of one affects the landscape is really, really important. What we do know from another study that is cited here, that we published, but is cited here in the feasibility study, is that California's grizzlies, at least prior to European colonization, were about 85% on average vegetarian, right? No way. Yep, they were about 85% vegetarian. Now, Their diets probably varied in different places. California is extremely diverse at the landscape level, and so the diets may have been different in the Northwest than in the South, for example. But we were able to begin a process of trying to figure out how much food still remains on the landscape for them. We're going to be continuing this in the next year. But what we've been able to do is start to map what we know are really important grizzly foods. And it turns out that in a lot of the areas that the modeling shows could be potential habitat, there's still a lot of grizzly foods and a significant diversity of them, at least plant foods. We also looked at this from a predicted space use perspective. So if the bears were out there in this suitable habitat, where would they go? Would they go running off and end up in the Central Valley or Los Angeles? That wouldn't be good, right? Would they stay in the kind of protected areas? And so we were able to use models that have been developed by a scholar named Sarah Sells in Montana to try and figure this out. And we projected it onto the landscape, and we found that the protected areas in California have a lot of really good habitat that would contain a lot of bears and encourage them to live in those areas. And we were also able to identify some potential areas where the bears might be more likely to wander outside of protected areas that you'd want to focus on for coexistence and conflict avoidance sort of strategies proactively ahead of time. Finding 4 is that a safe and successful recovery effort would involve pretty modest investments, but those investments would also benefit a bunch of other species and communities, including black bears. So the estimate that we came up with is that a robust recovery plan for grizzlies in California would cost less than $3 million a year. That maybe sound like a lot of money over the first 10 years, but it's less than 1% of Cal Fish and Wildlife's current budget, although the budget goes up and down a lot over the years. And so any measures that you would put in place to try to promote the safe existence and coexistence of grizzly bears in California would also benefit species like black bears. And we can see this from the history of bear conflict incidents in the national parks. On the right here, those are measures of conflicts in Yellowstone over time associated with black and grizzly bears. And so what I want to point out to you here is that on the top we have incidents of bear-caused damage per million visitors, 1931 to 1959, 1960 to 1982, and 1983 to 2012. We have the next one down, the middle one, bear-caused injuries per million visitors, 1931 to 59, same time frame. And then nuisance bears removed, so bears taken out of the population because they were potentially causing a problem, per million visitors. What I want to point out here is that although we've got a lot of issues dealing with black bears in our communities today, the national parks have largely solved this issue. The challenge is figuring out how to use the techniques that we know work in the national parks in communities that are way, way harder, right? That is the real challenge of today. So I want to point this out because the grizzly bears in California would not be like the black bears running around in Mammoth. They would be in the most remote areas of the state, most remote non-desert areas of the state, in wilderness areas, and the population would grow very slowly over time. Speaking of population growth, we also did some population viability analyses, basic ones. There's a lot of room for improvement here and building on this. But what we found using data from Montana and some established models projected onto the California landscape is that a very small population of a handful of bears introduced into a place like the Southern Sierra, Sequoia National Park, for example, would succeed, they would thrive, but they would grow slowly over time based on data from reintroduction and recovery programs in northwestern Montana. Now, if you assume, though, that problems emerge, like bears wander out of the protected areas and occasionally get hit by a car, which would be bad, would be terrible, then the population trend changes over time. And if you assume that there are lots of these post-release effects, lots of problems associated with the bears actually establishing themselves and then successfully having offspring in these areas, the population eventually winks out, assuming that you don't add more bears to it slowly over time. And so the point here is really to try to imagine different kinds of scenarios that could occur, to think through them very critically, and to think about the possibility both if the bears don't do well, how you would manage that, but also if they start to do really well, how you would manage that as well. That's been the case in Italy, where reintroductions have led to the bears doing a little bit better than was expected a little bit earlier on, and that became its own sort of issue. Another point I want to make about this is that it used to be that moving brown bears around was very, very hard and rarely led to success. Now, if you look historically, only about 70 instances of translocating brown bears, moving them from place to place, have actually been documented in the literature. Whereas people have moved American black bears hundreds or maybe thousands of times that are documented in the literature. We have far less information about brown bears. But what we do know is that over time, the success rate has increased dramatically. Back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, even 60s, 70s, and 80s, moving a brown bear from one place to another, most of these happened in Europe, was not likely to succeed. During the 1990s and 2000s, the chances increased dramatically because the techniques increased dramatically, the preparation increased dramatically, the knowledge about how to do it increased dramatically, and the people that were doing it were very well trained, very experienced, and have done an amazing job in places like Italy, France, Slovenia, and also Montana, and coming soon in southern British Columbia as well. Okay, so finding number 6, and this is where I'm gonna transition here into some comments. So recovering grizzlies in California is not just about the bears. It's a complicated choice at a really challenging time, and it's really about people and about the kind of future we want. And so I want to just make some comments here that kind of reflect some things I'm thinking about for the book project. And these really diverge from the very practical approach here. This is a document that presents a kind of out-of-the-box idea, but does it in a really conservative way using very established methods. The book is going to try to do something else a little bit different. And so I want to reflect on why all of this is so challenging. So it's really, really hard to even think about this. It's a hard thing to think about, and it's a hard thing to talk about. This idea of bringing this, apex consumer, this big, powerful animal, potentially back to a place like California. In my experience, you actually learn a lot about someone from how they react to this topic. So in a way, it's kind of like a mirror pointing at our society and ourselves to even bring up this idea of living with grizzly bears. Now, I actually think that's one of the great contributions of these animals, that they show us things about ourselves that we may not want to see or that may otherwise be really difficult to see. So we can really thank them for that. But okay, fine. Really, why is it so hard to think clearly and to talk about this animal? It's not because we don't know enough. The brown bear is probably the most studied, or maybe one of the most studied, large animal species on Earth in terms of the amount of literature that's out there, even if it's also one of the most misunderstood. Now, I love grizzly science for sure, and I participate in it, but more information is not going to change this. It's also not because the bears are dangerous. They're mostly not dangerous, as long as you pay them the courtesy of not sneaking up on them, and the statistics really show this. And it's not because there's not enough habitat. Once you start looking into it, like we did, you realize that there's probably plenty. It's also not because there are too many people living in California. As I mentioned, there are something like 9 times the amount of brown bears, the number of brown bears living in Europe, outside Russia, as there are in the lower 48 US states, same species. Europe has few real wilderness areas and more than double the population of the lower 48 US states. And European Russia has something like 2.5 times the number of the rest of the bears in Europe combined. So what is it? Why is this so hard to think about? Why is it so hard to talk about? Why is it so scary? There are probably a lot of reasons. I'm going to give you just 3 of them that I've been thinking about recently. One is that it's really hard because of history. In the case of grizzly bears, we've often chose to sanitize history or erase it altogether. But that doesn't mean it goes away. How does one talk about a genocide and an extinction that were linked? How does one talk about our responsibility to the past and the future? And how should we talk about a painful history that those of us in this room did not participate in, but that most of us benefit from anyway? I love grizzly bear science, but when we reduce these animals only to scientific objects, we make it nearly impossible to talk about to answer or maybe even to ask a lot of these crucial questions. It's also because of psychology. For 225 years, since the time of Lewis and Clark, grizzlies have been the subject of what has essentially been kind of a smear campaign. This wasn't based on people's actual experiences. It was a plot device in a story about white men conquering and subduing a continent. The grizzly wasn't known to indigenous peoples in North America as a monster. It became a monster because the story needed a monster. But those monster stories were repeated so many times in so many different ways by so many different people that they became something like facts. And in some ways, then, we've even manifested them in our adversarial approach to these animals as realities in a kind of recursive loop that looks a lot like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the psychology is something that we make real in the way we approach these animals. And finally, I think it's hard because we live in a society with deeply problematic institutions that until very recently, like the past few months, have seemed absolutely permanent, like permanent features of our world. These institutions have often claimed total control, even when they obviously lack the capacity to do much. Many of us here, I think, probably believe in the promise of institutions, federal, state, local, nonprofit, et cetera. But I also suspect that many folks here are deeply disappointed and frustrated with them. I mean, I can tell you, I work in one of those institutions, and it is extremely frustrating. That makes this present moment of institutional deconstruction that we're in, it gives it kind of a bit of cognitive dissonance. It's really hard to know what to think. And I don't want to portray this as a glass half full at all. I have friends and colleagues who are suffering, and at least 2 who've left this field entirely, and those losses are devastating. But here's what I can say. No other species besides the grizzly bear, I think, better embodies these historical, psychological, and institutional challenges and contradictions. That's why grizzly bears are so hard to think about, not because they're just scary or something like that, but because they embody the challenges that are at the heart of the things we're facing in society more broadly. But I would also argue that this is why it makes it absolutely essential that we do talk about them, that we do think about this, and that we do have that conversation. And maybe just starting that conversation is the next chapter in the story of the California grizzly. I'll just show you a last couple pictures. This is a photo. For those of you who read Spanish, know our bears. Looks a lot like a photo, like something you might want to see around Mammoth, Protect Our Bears. This is in Spain, in northern Spain, where the population of brown bears has recovered from something like 50 bears about 3 decades ago to something like 450 today. And there are communities where there's very little industry left in those areas that are benefiting from ecotourism around them. This is a terrible photo of a mountain called Escudilla. Has anybody ever read Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold? You might remember the story of Escudilla and the last grizzly bear in Arizona. At the end of that story, Leopold says, you know, now it's just a mountain, right? Well, now it doesn't even seem like it's a mountain anymore. About 15 years ago, a terrible fire ripped through there, burned it all the way to the mineral soil, and nothing has really recovered since. And I think that for that area, the grizzly is kind of a symbol of the mismanagement and of the loss of a whole lot of different things. And finally, this is a picture also from Spain, looking at bears across the valley. And one of the things I really like about this spot is that it reminds me a lot of home. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm sure folks have a lot to say. So let's take some questions. Yes?
If you were to overlay the habitat of the brown bear and the black bear, would they be the same? And what do you think the impact of the introduction of the brown bear to these areas would affect the black bear population?
Great question. It's really hard to know. You know, in many areas, black bears and brown bears live in the same places. They have largely overlapping diets. That is partly, there's a kind of notion that is partly the case because they evolved kind of separately for a long period of time and then sort of came back together in North America when brown bears did arrive here. There are areas where there's only one or the other. There are a few islands off the coast of British Columbia where there are black bears or brown bears, but not both, but those are island situations, and so there's a question of how that kind of became the way it did. Generally, in areas where the two species live, brown bears get the best resources at the best time because they're able to exclude the black bears. If you go to Alaska and go to one of the amazing rivers like at Brooks Falls where you can see brown bears feeding on salmon there, you won't really see black bears around there. They're somewhere else doing something else at that time. So the brown bears tend to get the best resources, but they partition resources, which means that they can exist kind of in the same area, eating a lot of the same things, but kind of circulating around in a way that enables them to access different resources at different times in the same general space. So there's definitely got to be some competition between them in that way. There has never really been an experiment where brown bears have been reintroduced on a large scale in a way that it would actually result in a significant change in competition for the resident black bears in an area. So we don't really know. In the future, we might be able to learn more about that question if we are able to bring grizzly bears back to the North Cascades and see what happens with the black bears there, but it's really, really hard to tell. Some folks would like to argue that bringing brown bears back might bring black bears into a little bit more of an equilibrium because the black bear population is so large in some areas right now. But considering the fact that black bears are so much more willing to habituate and become food conditioned than black bears are than brown bears, and considering, that black bears have a higher potential fertility rate, it's really difficult to say whether bringing grizzlies back would have any significant short-term effect on the black bears in that area. Yes?
You probably have this figure on the top of your head.
Uh-huh.
What was the population of grizzlies in California pre-Anglo?
Yeah, thanks. So it's hard to pin an exact number on that, but there have been a variety of attempts to calculate that. So Joseph Grinnell, back in the 1930s, estimated 3,000, but he said that was a low number. Then a couple of his students, years later, in that 1955 book, estimated 10,000, and they said that they thought that was closer to the truth. Several years ago, an amazing grizzly bear scientist and advocate named David Mattson, who just passed away, unfortunately, last month, did a modeling study based on a kind of more sophisticated assessment of habitat by state. And his number has a range. And so for California, it was between about something like 8,000, I think, and 11,000. So that's within that 10,000 range. Here's the thing. The population of grizzlies probably increased somewhat during the era of Spanish and Mexican colonial history. And the reason for that is that the Spanish, when they first arrived and set up shop in 1769, they came with a small number of livestock. But those herds ballooned dramatically over the next several decades, such that by the 1830s, there were more than 500,000 livestock, many of them feral, wandering around in California. Many of them died on the range. Scavengers of all kinds were eating them. We can see their isotopic signatures in specimens of coyotes, condors, and other species from that era. And so it's almost certain that grizzly bears were taking advantage of that as well. And we found in our study of grizzly bear diets that although the bears were about 85% vegetarian prior to European colonization, that number by the 1830s, with the samples that we have, may have gone down to about 70%. So the amount of terrestrial protein they were getting was double, at least for the bears that we have in our sample. And so you would expect that was a real boon for them and that the populations probably increased somewhat during that time. And I guess what this says is that there were a lot of bears, but the population changed over time. The Spanish and Mexican era may have been good for them, but the habit of eating livestock did not turn out to be very good for them after 1849. So that's a long way of saying 10,000. By the way, here's a good thing. Here's a good stat. On the eve of the gold rush, 1840s, there were only about 110,000 people in California at that point. The The Spanish and missions, and then later the Mexican ranchos, had a very difficult time attracting settlers to the region from further south from Mexico, because California was like the middle of nowhere, right, at that time. Didn't have much to offer. And so at that time, if there were 110,000 people and 11 or 10,000 grizzly bears, that's a ratio of about 11 to 1. So one grizzly bear for about every 11 people in California on the eve of the gold rush. Yes?
So historically, I'm going to bring it into wolves.
Uh-huh.
Wolves have had a bad rap, right, for centuries, going back to like childhood stories, the big bad wolf, and
Yep.
wolves are dangerous and this and that. But like to this day, you never hear or see stories about, like, very rarely, you know, human-wolf interaction.
Yeah.
It's usually wolves killing
Yep.
livestock. Whereas with the grizzly bear in particular,
Yep.
you know, in places like Yellowstone, the big headline stories are usually like hiker gets mauled, or
Yeah.
runner gets, you know, run up a tree, and like we almost moved to Canada a few years ago, and I was kind of like, well, I like to spend time in the backcountry, but there are grizzly bears here, and I'm like concerned about this. So yeah, so this is just like a general.
Yeah. So maybe just a few thoughts in response to that. One is that the way that the media reports these things leads folks to believe that these episodes are both more common and more random than they actually are. The vast majority of incidents involving bears in general are bears that have become food conditioned, right? And so when you see that something bad happened with a bear, I mean, there was someone who was killed in Florida just yesterday by a black bear. And it's believed, although it hasn't been completely confirmed yet, that the person was feeding the bear. So there's an example of that. Statistically, there are about 1.5 human deaths per year in North America associated with all kinds of bears. 1.5. So that's a small number, but it's not zero, right? It's a small number compared to 45,000 automobile deaths in the U.S. a year, that kind of thing. But that's not the way people perceive this, right? That's not what it means to them. And when you hear a story, right, and people tell these stories over and over and over again, when you hear a story, it takes on a kind of a larger than life sort of thing. So for me, I think that the most important thing, you know, we can do around this issue is to do the things we already know work, which is to keep bears away from food, one, and then two, and this is the thing with grizzly bears, this is really the thing. Don't surprise them. Don't sneak up on them. Let them know you're coming. And why is that? So there's a whole theory behind this. The theory, and maybe it's just a kind of just so story, but I'll tell you what the theory is. So black bears, okay, step back. Grizzly bears did not evolve to become an apex species. They were not that for almost their entire evolutionary history. They became that when the apexes all died out, when the giant short-faced bears and dire wolves and American lions and all of those creatures disappeared, right? And they were the last biggest ones standing. Before that, they had been a medium-sized creature for all of their evolutionary history. Okay, so that's one thing just to remember. Okay, black bears are more of a forest-associated species. We live with them all the time, right? We see them. There was one in Santa Barbara on campus just a week ago for the first time in a while. Did you hear that? Yeah. Yeah. So black bears, when they encounter a threat, they tend to go for the trees. We all know what great climbers they are even as adults, right? Brown bears tend to be not nearly as good of climbers as adults, and so they have really two options when confronted by a threat. They can run, which is what they do almost all the time, or they can stand their ground, which is what they do occasionally, right? And so the key with a brown bear, when you're in grizzly country, and I've spent a lot of time around these animals in those places, particularly in British Columbia, but elsewhere too, is to announce your presence whenever you're out in the backcountry and let them know you're coming. Now, this is a hard thing to do if you're a hunter, right? Right? Which is why in Europe, a lot of the incidents involve hunters because, you're sneaking around, you're dealing with animal guts, you're doing that sort of thing. But if you do that, then the chance of having a bad encounter with the bear goes down to almost zero. There are also some very interesting statistics associated with this. There was a study done by Bombieri et al. Several years ago that looked globally at incidents associated with brown bears. About 1.5 a year in the US, about 1.5, or North America, about 1.5 a year in Europe, and maybe up to a couple a year in Asia, although we don't really know. And they found that almost all of the lethal incidents involved men, full-grown men who were alone, right? And so there are probably some reasons for that. So in Europe, for example, it's men who are out tending sheep most of the time. It's men who are out hunting. So you're in situations where you're likely to have anything bad that could happen to you in the mountains happen to you, right? So that's one thing. But the other thing that tells you is that the idea that a lot of us grew up with about being in the backcountry and leaving no trace, where you're supposed to blend into your surroundings, where you're supposed to be really quiet, you're supposed to do those sorts of things so you don't disturb the person in the next campsite over. Traveling in grizzly country is the opposite. You're supposed to have fun. You're supposed to be with a gregarious group. You're supposed to talk. You can sing, right? These are the things that really work. And we also know they work because these are traditions that indigenous people have been using in North America for thousands of years, from Mexico to California to British Columbia to Alaska. Talk to the bears. Yeah.
Just to steal your field of view here, do you know the story of the Polish reintroduction in 1937 and 38? To me, it's fascinating that they were doing that in the midst of the run-up to war.
Yeah.
Do you know the story?
I have a colleague, a Russian colleague, who has done some historical work on that. She was working on a project on that last time I talked to her. It was a couple years ago, before the war, et cetera. So I know about the story. Balaweshka Forest, that was one of the ones that was, yeah. It was a failed reintroduction, but it was an attempted one. But one of the things I do know about that, I don't know about the 1930s version of the story, but another couple bears have turned up there in recent years on their own. And so this is an area that's long been proposed as a reintroduction and recovery site, going back many decades for brown bears. And it looks like there's a chance that they may be naturally recolonizing that area on their own from populations further to the south. So it's, I don't know too much about the story going back to the 30s, but I do know that it's not over and there are more chapters in that one.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Yes?
On the regulatory side here in California, what is let's say the tribal leadership in, let's say, the Klamath Basin,
Yep.
say that, hey, we want bears back in our area. How does that work with the state or federal, on the federal level with, if the tribe wants it on their lands, can that happen?
That's a great question. Chapter 9 in the study is on the legal dimension of this. It was written by Brendan Cummings, who's an amazing environmental lawyer, head of the Center for Biological Diversity. And so he talks about some of those sorts of issues. One thing I do want to say that's really cool is at the end of this month, I'm going with a small group, a little delegation. One of the folks in the group is Tiana Williams, who's an amazing wildlife biologist who was one of the prime movers behind the California condor reintroduction program in the Humboldt area, member of the Yurok tribe and an amazing wildlife biologist and conservationist, is going to be on that. We're going to go to an indigenous grizzly conservation roundtable in Vancouver and then go up to northern Vancouver Island to see some bears in a First Nations owned and run bear viewing operation up there. So that's going to be a lot of fun. And it's part of this conversation about what would it be like if we did it here. So the state is really in the driver's seat in a lot of ways on the question of reintroduction of something like a California condor, right, within state boundaries, even though the condor is listed, federally listed as well. Moving animals across state lines is a federal thing, right? And so there are questions around that. So if you wanted to bring in a bear from Montana, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would certainly be involved. Currently, grizzly bears throughout the lower 48 U.S. states are listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. They have been since 1975. In January, the service proposed a new map that basically would have just included the Northern Rockies and North Cascades as the listing unit, which in theory would have meant that any bears that turned up or were put in other places were not federally listed. But that's not going anywhere right now, so we don't know what the future of that is. And then there's this kind of broader question of tribal sovereignty, right? And so it's very hard for the tribes, given their restricted areas and capacity, to do these things on their own right now. But I think, as we saw with the condor case, and as we've seen in some other cases, including cases involving grizzly bears, near Ronan in the Flathead Valley north of Missoula, the tribe there was able to force the state of Montana to develop a series of wildlife overpasses on the highway there because grizzly bears were getting hit by cars, right? And so there was a sense in which that was something that the tribe couldn't do on its own, didn't have the capacity, didn't have the jurisdiction, didn't have the authority, but it could push the state into doing that. And so there's no real clear answer to your question. I guess what I will say is that right now, we're in a period of significant change, I think, in terms of the roles of tribes in a lot of these issues, a lot of these questions. Capacity is increasing, engagement is increasing. There's some amazing people with a lot of real passion and knowledge who are getting involved from a lot of these communities. And I think that this story is going to be really different in the years to come, and I think you're going to be seeing more tribal-led recoveries and reintroductions. Yes?
So aside from the big cultural value of grizzlies to
Mm-hmm.
peoples, what are some possible benefits? Why?
Yeah.
Why is it a reintroduction?
So I am always, my talk said maybe even the why, and I am always reluctant to go down this road. And the reason is because we live in a society where that is a question that we always have to be asking, right? And in a lot of societies throughout time, that wouldn't even be a question. Like if you were living in a Chumash community 300 years ago, the question wouldn't be, why do we need grizzly bears, right? But that's the way we think here now. And the way we do that is we use logical arguments to try to persuade others who may or may not be persuadable, right? So we have an adversarial, argument-based sort of society around these questions of why. So it's always tough to say why you would do anything like this, right? Like why would you do anything why would you do anything at all, right? In our society, right? You can always have an argument against it. However, I can think of at least 4 good reasons. One is the ecological part. A keystone species was lost. A tremendous, range of ecological functions were lost, and we don't even know what they were because nobody studied it before or really much even since, right? So it's all speculation. So there's this way in which the reintroduction of the grizzly bear could teach us about the importance of the grizzly bear itself in a way that we might never know what California ecosystems have lost. Everything from species richness to vegetation structure to even fire behavior in some systems in California. So that's one. 2 would be for the species itself. The way recovery has been defined for grizzlies in the lower 48 U.S. states right now, if the recovery were to fully succeed, completely succeed, and we declare victory, there would be about 3,000 grizzly bears in the lower 48 states. The estimate is that there are about 50,000 in 1800. So the way we've set up the recovery, we could declare the species fully recovered with a 94% decline. Okay, so a broader benefit for the future, securing the future of the species in a wider range of places. That's one. I think that there's the kind of cultural and justice part that you alluded to there. We've already talked about that a bit. But then there's this other thing that's, I think, like, for me personally, as a teacher, as a parent, as a scholar, as someone who's a member of communities like this that I'm really passionate about, it has to do with something a lot less tangible. It has to do with the idea of imagination, with the idea of inspiration, and with the notion that, you know, we're at a point in our history right now in California where it often seems like nothing can get done. I mean, we've all been hearing that conversation, right? We've all been listening to that conversation. High-speed rail, you know, housing, like all of these things that it seems like we should be able to do that we haven't been able to do, and like, what's going on? How did we get ourselves into this position? The Grizzly case is something that has been portrayed as impossible for 100 years, and it turns out it's totally possible, right? Very likely, if we actually prioritized and invested in it. And the value of doing something where you turn something that was impossible into something that's possible, I think is tremendous, is really significant. It's meaningful to potentially to young people, and it opens up other kinds of doors. And so for me, like I said, as a parent, as a teacher, that intangible part might be the most important. Yes, sir, in the back.
Based on the amount of red tape that to do anything these days, you know, if there was a political will to get this accomplished, what's your timeline? 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, 30?
You know, I think that the big question is, how are these institutions going to be changing in the years to come? You know, you're right about the red tape part, and part of that is really important because you, in something like this, you want to be very deliberate. You really want to do it very, very carefully. You want to start slow. You want to plan it out well. You want to monitor it. You want to do all the things that you need to do to ensure success for people, to ensure that it goes well, to ensure that you create the context for future success, and also to do well by the animals themselves. You want to do all of those things, right? So there's a reason to go slow. On the other hand, I think that we're going to be seeing maybe some loosening of some of that red tape around some of these things in the future. That certainly there's a lot of wind blowing in that direction in our society right now. So we'll kind of see what happens with that, for better or worse. What I would say is that if you look at the case of the North Cascades, people started thinking about bringing grizzly bears back to the North Cascades in the 1980s when the first recovery plans were being developed for grizzlies in the lower 48 states. Then in the 1990s, some researchers started going out there and saying, well, wait a minute, are there even any grizzlies here? We don't even know. Maybe there's some coming down from British Columbia. Let's go and try to find out. They didn't find any, right? And so that was in the 1990s. Then there was a long process in the 2000s where people started talking about it. There were proposals. The National Park Service was starting to move it forward. There were community meetings. All this stuff was going on. There was an environmental impact statement that was prepared. Then it was thrown out completely as administrations changed. And then when it finally got to the point where the stars were aligned and people were pretty aligned, it had like a 75% approval rate in the state of Washington, even though there were some communities where people were quite concerned. Then the writing of the environmental impact statement and the approval of it only took a couple years. So I think that there is a lesson to be learned from that, which is that there's a time for everything, right? And that with big projects like this, the key is to have those long conversations, do that in-depth planning, prepare in all the ways that are possible so that when the time does come, you're ready.
Well, thanks, Pete. I love this conversation. I love it when there's no easy answers. So I just want to thank Pete for being here and all of this conversation. And I'm sure if you want to come up and continue that conversation, Pete will be here for a little bit. And I hope to see the rest of you next week.
Thank you.